there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Any epoch will exhibit a dominant aesthetic or stylistic culture. And design history as a discipline uses style and the form of things as a way of investigating culture. The idea that a thing expresses something more than itself.
From the post-war modern style to the diversity of the new millennium, explore 6 decades of Canadian design.
The reason why design is important in Canada is because it is what defines us as a culture. It also defines us in our everyday world.
Delve into the collection of the Design Exchange, Canada's National Design Museum, to uncover the exceptional stories behind the objects of everyday life. These are the symbols of our cultural past and present. The 1980s was a decade of excess and materialism across the Western world. The flashy era marked an increase in conspicuous consumption, and the 80s are often associated with decadence and a glorification of capitalism. Wealth distribution became more concentrated during this decade, and the yuppie culture emerged. This decade saw an emphasis on status and power. The 1980s were in many ways big, bold, and over the top. During the early 80s, Canada continued to be governed by Pierre Trudeau. In 1982, he brought home the Constitution so that it was no longer under British jurisdiction, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was established. Shortly after Trudeau's retirement, the Conservatives came to power under Brian Mulroney, winning the election by a landslide. In the early 80s, Canada underwent a major recession. Mulroney hoped to revitalize the Canadian economy and, unlike Trudeau, strove to forge closer ties with the United States. Throughout the decade, designers embraced a more pluralist look, creating objects that challenged earlier perceptions of good design. Despite various economic changes during this period, design from the 1980s was dynamic, original, and often audacious. Design by Decade revisits some of the most vital and expressive designs of this era.
The 1980s saw a type of return to a type of confidence. If the 1960s was fight the power and the countercultural revolution, if the 1970s was I'm so depressed because the 60s euphoria and exuberant moment is sort of gone, and here we are having economic catastrophe and the world's in a miserable place, the 1980s, we see capitalism is back. We've finally returned to money. When I think about the 1980s, I think about the popularity of the word power. Power walking, power lunch, power nap, power as a type of corporate manifestation of thank God we're back to money.
I think that the 80s certainly symbolized capitalism and the growth of greed. Greed is good. And the idea that you saw a lot of mergers and acquisitions. The more money you made, the better.
There was definitely a show of wealth in the 80s, wealth and power, and the 80s was about being over the top. So clothes were over the top, they were very embellished. Designs were over the top, they showed a lot of dynamic movement.
What you're seeing are designers that are introducing a much stronger sense of individual style. And I think probably the most famous one of that time to emerge is Philip Starck. Here he's looking at design as an expression of emotion and art and of individuality, and you're breaking the Bauhaus canon that form should follow function. What is wrong with a little bit of contradiction? What's wrong with a little bit of humor? What's wrong with a little bit of history and historicism? There's a rich culture that we can embrace.
Attache case, designed by Michel Dallaire in 1983, is a vibrant example of playful 80s design coming out of Canada. It's also emblematic of the decade's preoccupation with power and corporate life. The case was designed for Quebec-based firm Raisontel, who were looking for an easy and efficient product to produce themselves. Dallaire more than delivered.
If you design a product that is very simple, there's no, fantasy about it. It's straightforward, honest, and then you have a much longer life for the product.
Michel Dallaire is one of Quebec's foremost industrial designers, responsible for prominent designs such as the 1976 Olympic torch and the original Bixby bike system. Dallaire's iconic Attache case is still in production, being made and sold by Plasticase out of Quebec. The simple yet clever case continues to sell internationally.
Quebec designer Michel Dallaire's Attache case is a remarkable riff on your father's traditional briefcase. It is unlike any briefcase you've seen before, and yet it's a briefcase. So right there it evokes the past, the history of briefcases, but it also says, gee, briefcases can be something new and fun and remarkable.
The Attache case is quite a brilliant design. It's brilliant because it's so simple. It's made out of polypropylene plastic, and there are two identical shells that snap together.
Why in plastic was that it gave us the potential of having a very nice shape and to have an object that would be very simple, very easy to maintain, and very low cost. The tooling is an injection mold, so when you design in thermoplastic, you also work with the emptiness of steel. You have to machine steel material in order to leave space for the thermoplastic. So it is in fact a work of sculpture. Injection molding is a very well-known technology. We use resin in the form of pallets. And then we put that into a container. The thermoplastic will melt and then will be pushed into the cavity at a certain pressure. The main idea was to design a briefcase that will use only one shell. Then we had the advantage of having only one cavity. One half of the briefcase is mold. Then we mold the second one, and then we turn them front to front. Then it creates three-dimensional containers. So it's a very simple concept. Total, you have 6 parts. Two pivot, metal pivot, 2 closing device, and 2 shell, identical.
So suddenly you have a type of plastic briefcase, which is a slight contradiction in terms, a material that we tend to think of as cheap and throwaway, being used to make an object that holds things of importance, monetary and cultural value.
Simplicity is the big challenge, because it's very easy to complicate things, and it's not that easy to simplify everything.
It was significant that Dallaire's Attache case was sold at the Museum of Modern Art's store in New York City. It was initially not popular, but then all of a sudden it became the object of choice within the design community.
Everybody wanted it because the MoMA gave this product a lot of prestige and novelty. We sold millions of these things. L'Attache case is actually a very practical product. First of all, it's a good value because it costs little to produce. It sells to the distributor at a very reasonable price, and it goes to the consumer at the price of a medium pizza.
This understated design is multifunctional yet fun. The Attache case uses smart, simplified design and manufacturing techniques, resulting in an object with enduring allure. During the 1980s, Canada underwent significant political and economic changes. Across much of the Western world, there was renewed focus on wealth and the business world. Consumption continued to grow, and society's material desires expanded. The key aesthetic movement during this time was postmodernism, whose roots can actually be traced back to the 1960s. Postmodernism is a complex umbrella term that describes a style that celebrates difference and interpretation. The cultural and aesthetic movement was a reaction against modernism, which emphasized form and function and sought to develop a universal look. Modernism was minimal, and postmodernism was decorative and ornate.
Postmodernity as a movement in design culture is usually most associated with the 1980s. It's most particularly associated with a movement coming out of Milan in 1982 called Memphis, and with developments in New York and the work of Knoll Furniture. If you think about the work of Robert Venturi and colleagues, who wrote a book called Learning from Las Vegas, they would argue that Las Vegas, with the strip of all of those remarkable casinos and neon and flamingos and fountains and Caesar's Palace, that was true life, not the banking towers of Mies van der Rohe with their black mullions and steel girders.
Some of the finest examples of this style appear in architecture, most notably the buildings of esteemed architects Michael Graves and Philip Johnson. In Canada, one of the first examples of postmodernism in architecture is the Mississauga City Hall, designed by Edward Jones and Michael Kirkland. Postmodernism became the dominant form of expression in design in Canada in the 1980s.
In terms of design and aesthetics, postmodernism rejected the type of purism of high modernist design, that type of unrelenting, uncompromising, driving, and fierce aesthetic of technology. Postmodernism looked to the past. Why not have a fluted column? Why not look to Art Nouveau? Why not look to everything that's ever been as a legitimate way of expressing meaning and identity? Postmodern means everything's up for grabs.
So this whole idea that you could actually embrace the past and embrace color and embrace humor and embrace irrational concepts breathes a whole new life into design and inspired many architects and product designers.
The Nexus chair is a remarkable example of a design that uses decorative elements and also references the past. Designed by Paul Epp in 1983, the Nexus chair was made by an important collective called Ambient Systems. Founded in 1968, Ambient was an innovative design-focused distributor and eventual manufacturer of furniture, until its demise in 1989. The Nexus chair is an elegant yet functional object that was available in a variety of configurations.
Paul Epp's Ambient chair is a good example of a transitional chair from modernism. It's a very simple production, a handful of parts compose the whole chair. But to me it also does reference history, and you see some referencing to neoclassicism. You see a little bit of added decoration with the pattern of holes in the seat back.
The Nexus chair by Paul Epp is significant for several reasons. It evokes the past in several ways. It uses molded wood for its structure and its form, but that very design decision evokes a long history of chair making, going back to Scandinavia in the 1920s and 30s, the Eames in California, Canadians Skycold and Zerwinski, etc., etc. So Paul Epp is absolutely referencing the history of modernist furniture, but he's doing it within a postmodern chair, and that's again adding to the irony of the postmodern pastiche, that I can sample something I'm trying to actually refute, but I'm doing so ironically and, in the end, producing something wholly new and freestanding.
Ambient was a marketing company founded by a partnership of industrial designers, Keith Muller and Michael Stewart. They founded this company to specifically market their designs to a broader audience. There was nobody else in Canada that was doing anything like that. Even the word design wasn't used that much at that time, but they were a design-driven company in an economy or a culture in which there were no design-driven companies, so they were very unique.
They were very inspiring for other designers and for industry and for creating the aesthetic of the 80s.
What's striking and puts that chair absolutely in the time it was made is that it has variations. The chair came in 8 possible configurations. You could get a chair without arms, you could get a chair with arms, you could have a chair with a solid seat, with a woven seat, any number of possibilities.
This all had to do with trying to make the market for it as big as possible. The Nexus chair was used in restaurants, stores, the library, offices. It had a very diverse application. If we look at work that was done earlier, I think it's a bit more severe. I think that it takes the constraints of modernist design a little more seriously, a little more doctrinaire. And I think that there's something a bit playful about the Nexus chair, which wouldn't have been so welcome a bit earlier.
I think Epp created something that's very much of the time and significant because of its complex and diverse presence.
Paul Epp's Nexus chair represents the aesthetic transition from modernism to postmodernism in Canada. In this era, designers increasingly embraced playful and decorative elements in their creations. Not all objects from this period can be definitively categorized as postmodern, but designs that emerged in the 80s were undoubtedly influenced by the broad international movement. The Gazelle chair by Jonathan Crinion takes its moniker from the swift exotic animal.
One of my favorite 80s designs is the Gazelle chair. I think it's a wonderful design because it's an update of the sort of ubiquitous garden chair or metal cafe chair, which is quite clumsy. He adds so much design to it, if you will, because of the sculptural form of the elegant arms, which suggest the horns of a gazelle.
John Crinion's Gazelle chair represents an interesting development in the history of Canadian design. It references any number of things. It references French outdoor seating of cafes and restaurants of Paris. It evokes the molded, steamed wood technology of Thonet, the Austrian cabinet maker working at the turn of the 20th century. And it achieves it using tubular steel that has been anodized to form something that is at once, again, new and old.
It was, to me, a classic design, but very much from the 80s as well because of how it was made and the way the metal is treated, and also the very highly sculptural form of it. Not that Jonathan Crinion by any means is a postmodernist designer, but I think it was a great example of a design that's open to new aesthetics and new forms and not afraid to be sculptural rather than just functional.
The Gazelle chair is a poetic and graceful example of Canadian design coming out of the 1980s. Objects created during this era expressed a playfulness in their form and broke the rules imposed by earlier aesthetic movements. The 1980s were a dynamic decade in Canada, both economically and in terms of design. Many objects coming out of this era were influenced by the postmodern movement. A more diverse array of styles emerged, challenging the strict tenets of modernism. Designers worked with themes such as whimsy, irony, and history. As the decade progressed, Canada elected a conservative government, whose mandate included stimulating the Canadian economy.
In Canada, we had the Free Trade Agreement, which was huge in terms of how it affected industry, who could survive, no longer being protected by tariffs. The ones that survived became smarter and used design more as a tool and also invested in proper manufacturing equipment.
During this period, many medium-sized design firms, such as Ambient, were unable to survive. A number of office furniture companies, who were able to successfully export their products, eventually thrived. Examples of these include Technion, Kielhauer, and Nienkamper. At the same time, some smaller design-driven studio manufacturers emerged, creating bold and distinct objects that aptly represented the stylistic movement of the time.
One of the noticeable changes in Canadian design culture in the 1980s was the necessary emergence of artisan-based production.
The Jeff Goodman Studio, for example, is one of the leading glass studios in Canada. It was established in 1989 by prominent glass artist Jeff Goodman. The thoughtful and decorative Compass Bowl series was the studio's most lucrative object at that time.
Studio manufacturing is a very strong and important dimension of Canadian design. Some of our most important designers emerged from the studio craft movement. They would go into production themselves. They'd come up with a design or a concept and they would go and work with contractors or suppliers to assemble the work themselves.
Portico is an excellent example of a studio manufacturer established during this decade. Co-founded by Scott Lawton, James Brewer, and Scott Lyons, Portico was formed in 1987 and produced limited runs of furniture and lighting designs. The company was short-lived, but in its brief existence, it generated a number of striking designs. The Strala lamp is an important example of 1980s Canadian design and is an innovative relic of Portico's days.
Scott Lawton, a very talented Canadian designer, developed the Strala lamp when he was still in his senior year at OCAD. It was listed as one of the best designs of the 80s in Time magazine, but he couldn't get it produced. So what do? You set up your own company, your own studio, you basically rent a space and you buy your components and then you assemble them yourself.
I think the Strala lamp is remarkable. I think it captures the sort of witty culture of postmodernism, in which utilitarian objects are made to look in ways that are unexpected, and yet they still function. The shade is very small, making you think that it wouldn't project much light. In fact, it illuminates very effectively. And the on-off switch isn't located in that usual place, namely just slightly underneath the lampshade. Rather, Scott Lawton and Deacon mount the turning mechanism, the on and off switch, on a ball on a tube that turns. Original, smart, funny, cheeky, and effective.
The Strala lamp really embodies this idea that turning on a light is magical and is something ceremonial and symbolic. The idea of turning on the light is not just this boring functional knob, but it's a beautiful copper ball, and you'll enjoy the ritual of turning on the light.
The Strala lamp is a bold and expressive design representing many of the tenets of postmodernism. For design in this era, the possibilities were endless. The materialism and economic changes of the 1980s are reflected in the range of decorative designs that were produced in that dazzling decade.